Hello and welcome to Unbuilt Giants, a series that looks at the development and demise of some of history's most notable and sometimes bizarre skyscraper projects. The Palace of the Soviets was the most spectacular unbuilt architectural project of the Stalinist period and one of the most ambitious, unrealized buildings of the 20th century. Conceived as a Congress center, administrative monument, and ideological centerpiece for Moscow, it was intended to replace the destroyed Cathedral of Christ the Saviour with a colossal secular shrine to Soviet power. Its final form, associated above all with Boris Iofan and later with Vladimir Shchuko and Vladimir Gelfrake, combined Art Deco massing, neoclassical monumentality, Stalinist political symbolism, and American skyscraper technology. Had the mature version been completed, it would have dominated Moscow physically and symbolically. A stepped tower of vast cylindrical tiers rising above the Moskva River, crowned by an enormous statue of Lenin, and containing a grand assembly hall for more than 20,000 people. Its history is therefore not simply the story of a building that was never built, but of the Soviet state's attempt to remake architecture into a language of political destiny. The idea of a great Soviet Congress building emerged almost as soon as the Soviet Union itself was formally created. On December 30th, 1922, at the first All-Union Congress of Soviets, Sergei Kirov proposed the construction of a national convention center for the new state. The proposal fitted a wider post-revolutionary habit of using the word palace not for royal residences but for large public institutions, palaces of labor, palaces of culture, palaces of congresses, and similar buildings intended to make the people, rather than monarchs, the notional owners of grandeur. In practice, however, the early Soviet state was too poor, unstable, and exhausted by revolution, civil war, and economic crisis to build anything on the scale imagined. Competitions for buildings such as the Palace of Labor in Petrograd and Moscow in the early 1920s produced impressive ideas but no real construction. The dream survived because it answered a deep ideological need. The Soviet Union wanted a building that could equal or surpass the cathedrals, palaces, and skyscrapers of older societies, while claiming to represent a new social order. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, the political and economic setting had changed. Stalin's consolidation of power, the first 5-year plans, forced industrialization and the transformation of Moscow into the capital of a centralized socialist empire, created the conditions for a new kind of architectural ambition. The proposed building, initially described as a house of congresses, was revived at the end of 1930 or beginning of 1931 and soon renamed the Palace of the Soviets. It was intended to house the most important state gatherings, especially sessions of the Supreme Soviet, and to become the center of a reconstructed Moscow. At first, the project was more modest than the later fantasy, but its political importance encouraged constant enlargement. The palace had to be unique, technically advanced, legible to the masses, and superior to anything built by the capitalist world. The choice of site was crucial. Early discussions considered a relatively practical location near Okhotny Riyadh, northwest of the Kremlin, where demolition would have been easier and less symbolically charged. In 1931, however, the decision shifted to the site of the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour, near the Moskva River and close to the Kremlin. This was the most dramatic possible choice. The cathedral, completed in the 19th century as a monument to Russia's victory over Napoleon, was the largest Orthodox church in Moscow and a major symbol of imperial and religious continuity. Its destruction was therefore both an act of urban clearance and a political ritual. On December 5, 1931, the cathedral was dynamited. The Soviet state was not merely making room for a new building, it was staging the replacement of orthodoxy, monarchy, and historical memory by socialism, atheism, and the cult of revolutionary power. The project was shaped through a complicated series of competitions between 1931 and 1933. Boris Iofan, already trusted by the Soviet elite and known for the house on the embankment, occupied an unusually advantageous position. He was not just a competitor, but a central figure in the project's management structure, effectively acting as chief architect from the beginning. His closeness to party patrons, his experience in Italy, and his ability to translate political ambition into monumental architectural form made him ideally placed to survive the increasingly ideological selection process. The first preliminary round, held in 1931, attracted entries from different Soviet architectural tendencies, including modernist, constructivist, and more historically minded approaches, but it produced no definitive winner. The brief already made clear that the palace should be unlike any ordinary public building, and that professional architectural criteria would be subordinate to political judgment. The international competition that followed later in 1931 attracted world-famous architects, including Le Corbusier, Walter Gropius, and Erich Mendelsohn, as well as many Soviet entrants. Le Corbusier's proposal was admired by some architectural specialists for its functional organization, but its modernist language was increasingly out of step with the direction of Soviet politics. The Soviet leadership was moving away from the experimental architecture of the 1920s and towards an architecture of legibility, hierarchy, ceremony, and power. The top group of proposals included Iofan, Ivan Zholtovsky, and Hector Hamilton. Iofan's scheme had already begun to move away from radical modernism towards a more monumental composition, while Zholtovsky represented classical authority, and Hamilton offered a ribbed Art Deco language that resonated with contemporary American high-rise design. The competition did not simply select a building. It helped announce the end of constructivism as the dominant official language of Soviet architecture. Further rounds in 1932 and 1933 narrowed the field and increased the pressure to produce a tall, compact, monumental structure. Stalin's influence became more direct. He disliked schemes that seemed too reminiscent of churches or too awkwardly modernist, and he favored Iofan's proposal while demanding changes. Iofan's winning 1933 design was a stepped, ziggurat-like composition of massive tiers, grand staircases, colonnades, and a dominant central volume. At this stage, the building was already immense, but the most decisive alteration came when Stalin insisted that it should become a monument to Lenin. The original crowning figure, sometimes conceived as a liberated proletarian, was replaced by a colossal Lenin. This transformed the project from a gigantic Congress hall into a vertical political icon. The building itself became a pedestal. In 1933, the Politburo ordered Iofan to work with Vladimir Shchuko and Vladimir Gelfreich, two experienced architects associated with more theatrical and monumental forms. This was not a free artistic collaboration in the ordinary sense, but a politically imposed partnership. Iofan wished to preserve more of the balance of his earlier design, and at first preferred not to place an enormous statue directly on top of the main mass. Shchuko and Gelfreich pushed the scheme upwards, making the statue the climax of the whole composition. The final architectural language emerged from tension between Iofan's stepped cylindrical forms, stucco and Gelfreich's grand academic instincts, and the state's demand for an unmistakable symbol of Leninist authority. By 1937, the definitive design had taken shape. A stack of ribbed cylinders and narrowing tiers, rising from a huge stylobate and culminating in a 100-meter statue of Lenin. The specifications were extraordinary. The most commonly cited mature design gave the palace a total height of about 416 meters, including the statue, which would have made it taller than the Empire State Building and the tallest structure in the world at the time. Some later or variant accounts give a height closer to 495 meters, reflecting the changing and sometimes inconsistent nature of the project's development. Its planned weight was roughly 1.5 million metric tons. The Grand Hall was to be about 130 meters in internal diameter and 100 meters high, with seating for more than 20,000 people. The smaller hall was still enormous, planned for roughly 5,000 to 6,000 people, depending on the version. Additional reception halls, constitutional halls, offices and ceremonial spaces would have filled the stylobate and tower. The building was not conceived as a conventional skyscraper full of normal floors. Many of its interior levels would have had unusually great heights to accommodate state assemblies, circulation, ceremonial spaces, and mechanical systems. The engineering was as ambitious as the symbolism. The main circular core and the rectangular stylobate were to rest on separate foundations. The heavier core, containing the Grand Hall, tower, and statue, required foundations reaching deep into the limestone bedrock beneath the river level. The lighter stylobate could rest on shallower strata. Because the site was close to the Moskva River and affected by groundwater, engineers created a watertight curtain around the excavation by drilling boreholes and injecting hot bitumen into the ground. The excavation required the removal of huge quantities of soil and rock. The circular reinforced concrete foundation, with an external diameter of about 160 meters, was completed in January 1939. The structural frame of the palace was even more unusual. The Grand Hall created a vast internal void, so ordinary vertical columns could not simply pass straight through the center of the building. Instead, the load-bearing system had to wrap around and rise over the hall. The lower frame was planned with large paired columns around the hall, fixed to the foundation by massive steel shoes. Above this, inclined columns would form a tent-like structure over the void, transferring loads around the hall and up into the tower. Enormous steel rings would bind this system together. Above the hall, a more conventional vertical steel frame would continue upwards to support the upper tiers and the statue. The statue of Lenin itself, weighing thousands of tons, required its own steel frame and was to be clad in a corrosion-resistant metal. Its head alone would have been immense. Its outstretched arm and pointing hand were planned at such a scale that the finger would have been several meters long. The project also demanded a level of mechanical sophistication unusual for the Soviet Union of the 1930s. The palace was planned for tens of thousands of daily visitors. It required elaborate circulation systems, including more than 100 passenger lifts, service lifts, firefighting lifts, escalators, and monumental staircases. No lift could practically run through the entire height, so visitors to upper levels would have had to transfer between lift systems. The building's electrical demand would have been enormous, requiring redundant supply from new power stations. Ventilation, heating, cleaning, and waste disposal were treated as major engineering problems. The Grand Hall was to receive conditioned air through ducts serving the seating rows. Centralized vacuum cleaning, industrial rubbish disposal, and even devices for cleaning dust from visitors' shoes were planned. The project was therefore not merely a fantasy of stone and sculpture, it was an attempt to build a total technological environment for mass politics. Architecturally, the palace drew on many sources. Iofan's Italian background mattered. Scholars have noted echoes of the Pergamon altar, the Victor Emmanuel II monument in Rome, and the grand ceremonial architecture of imperial antiquity. The ribbed vertical treatment also reflected Art Deco tendencies and contemporary American skyscraper design. Soviet architects were paying close attention to the United States, especially New York, and delegations studied American construction methods, foundations, lifts, steel frames, and high-rise organization. Rockefeller Center was particularly important for Iofan's later thinking about setbacks and massing. Yet the Soviet leadership wanted to avoid the impression that the palace was merely an American skyscraper in Moscow. Its purpose was not commercial height, but ideological supremacy. It was to be a socialist mountain, a political cathedral, and an architectural proof that the Soviet system could absorb and surpass Western technology. The surrounding city was to be remade around it. The Palace of the Soviets was planned as the center of a new monumental Moscow, connected to a broad axis sometimes known as Ilyich Alley. This axis would have transformed the area from the southwest towards the northeast, linking the palace with major new avenues and spaces. In some redevelopment plans, whole districts between the palace and the Kremlin would have been demolished or opened up. The Moscow Manege was threatened. The Alexander Garden would have been leveled into a more formal route, and the Pushkin Museum was even considered for relocation because it obstructed the desired alignment. A huge reflecting pool was planned nearby, and the Palace Plaza would have become one of the largest ceremonial urban spaces in the world. These plans reveal that the palace was not an isolated building, but the intended center of a new capital composition. Construction moved slowly but genuinely. Geological surveys began in 1933, and excavation continued through the mid-1930s. The nearby metro station was named Dvorets Sovetov, or Palace of the Soviets, reinforcing the project's presence in everyday Moscow before the building existed. Special steels were developed for the frame, and components were fabricated at industrial plants before being transported by rail, tractor, and barge. By 1939, the foundation was complete, and the propaganda campaign around the palace had reached its height. Images of the completed building circulated on stamps, posters, postcards, packaging, films, and models. In visual culture, it became almost more real than the empty construction site. Soviet films presented it as part of the inevitable future Moscow. In Cosmic Voyage, it appeared as a futuristic background monument. In New Moscow, it became the climax of the reconstructed capital. In The Radiant Path, its image was manipulated within a broader cult of Stalinist achievement. The palace existed powerfully as an image even when it did not yet exist as a building. The German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 ended active construction. The war transformed priorities instantly. Laborers, engineers, and administrators were reassigned to defense work or military service. Construction workshops and factories were mobilized for wartime production. The partially erected steel frame and stored structural steel were dismantled and reused for fortifications, bridges, and other urgent military needs. By 1942, the frame had effectively been sacrificed to the war effort. Without the workers and systems required to maintain the site, water seeped into the foundations. The palace's vast pit became a flooded reminder of a suspended future. The war was the immediate reason the Palace of the Soviets was not built, but not the only reason. Even before 1941, the project had grown into something close to unmanageable. Its scale demanded immense quantities of steel, concrete, stone, machinery, skilled labor, and engineering coordination. It required the Soviet construction industry to master high-rise technology, deep foundations, vast span assembly spaces, and colossal sculpture simultaneously. The design also suffered from the contradictions of its own symbolism. The Lenin statue had to be high enough to dominate Moscow, but the higher it rose, the harder it became to see from the ground. The building had to be a functioning Congress center, but its role as a pedestal for an ideological idol distorted its proportions and structure. The project was technically possible in a broad sense, but only at extraordinary cost and under conditions of political stability, industrial abundance, and sustained leadership commitment. Those conditions did not survive the war. After 1945, Iofan tried to revive the project. He produced revised schemes during and after the war, including versions that were lower, heavier, flatter, or less dynamic than the pre-war design. Stucco had died in 1939, and Gelfreich moved on to other work. Stalin, however, appears to have lost interest. The symbolic role, once assigned to a single supreme tower, shifted after 1947 to the group of Moscow skyscrapers later known as the Seven Sisters. These high-rises, including Moscow State University and the Kotelnicheskaya embankment building, borrowed something from the palace's stepped vertical language, but distributed monumentality across the city. Instead of one impossible center, Moscow received a constellation of Stalinist towers. The Palace of the Soviets survived in official imagination for a few more years, but increasingly as paper architecture. The final blow came with the political and architectural turn after Stalin's death. Nikita Khrushchev attacked the excesses of Stalinist architecture in the mid-1950s, condemning wasteful ornament, monumental extravagance, and the diversion of resources from housing and practical construction. The Palace of the Soviets, with its giant statue, vast halls, costly cladding, and almost limitless appetite for materials, belonged to precisely the architectural culture Khrushchev wanted to discredit. A later competition in the late 1950s proposed a new, much smaller Palace of the Soviets, possibly on a different site near the Moscow State University area, but this too failed to become a real project. The function that the original palace was meant to serve was eventually taken over in reduced form by the Palace of Congresses inside the Kremlin, completed in 1961. The original site underwent a remarkable sequence of symbolic reversals. After the palace project was abandoned, the flooded foundation pit was adapted into the Moskva swimming pool, an enormous, open-air, heated pool, completed around 1960. The site that had held Russia's greatest Orthodox cathedral, then the foundations of the world's intended greatest socialist monument, became a place of public recreation. The pool survived into the post-Soviet period, but was closed in the 1990s. The Cathedral of Christ the Saviour was then reconstructed on the same site and consecrated in 2000. This final reversal gave the history of the Palace of the Soviets an almost allegorical form. The church destroyed for the palace returned after the palace failed, and the state that imagined it collapsed. The Palace of the Soviets remains one of the clearest architectural expressions of Stalinist ambition. It marked the transition from the experimental architecture of the early Soviet period to the monumental historicism of socialist realism. It absorbed international modernity while publicly rejecting modernism. It used American skyscraper technology while claiming ideological victory over capitalism. It replaced religious transcendence with political transcendence, and the Cathedral dome with Lenin's raised figure. Its failure was caused by war, material demands, technical difficulty, changing political priorities, and the eventual rejection of Stalinist excess. Yet, it cannot be dismissed as a mere fantasy. Foundations were built, steel was fabricated, engineers solved real problems, and the project shaped Soviet architecture even in absence. In drawings, models, films, and propaganda, it became the center of a Moscow that never existed. Its unbuilt status is part of its power. The Palace of the Soviets survives as the monument Stalinism imagined for itself, but could not finally bring into being. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and consider subscribing for more episodes coming soon. See you next time.